Well, welcome to the session 2 of our Advent series, and this week we're looking at church as kingdom in our place, which is a bit of a mouthful, but hopefully that will become clear. I'd like to read Isaiah 40 and verse 3, I think it is, says, "A voice of one calling in the wilderness, prepare the way for the Lord, make straight in the desert a highway for our God." We know, don't we, that the Gospels make it clear that this voice in the wilderness is John the Baptist. And John the Baptist calls people to turn away from living for themselves, to change their ways, to literally face not this direction, which is living for self, but to turn and live and to change their thinking and face God. This is a preparation for the one who is coming. We prepare by turning away from crooked paths and fixing on the ways and the life that God calls us to. And of course, John then points to Jesus, and he is the one who is coming, who has now already come, because he's among us, as John says. He is the one who is full of the Spirit. He will see into the hearts of people and know their intent. He'll not just weigh their actions, but he'll know exactly what's going on in here, in the centre of our hearts. And then this Jesus establishes a just kingdom where the poor and the needy benefit. And there's this landscape, isn't there, in Isaiah, where the predator preys on the weak is now turned on its head, and so the lion will lie with the lamb and a little boy will put his hand into the nest of the snake and not be bitten. And all the peoples of the world will flock to this kingdom when this servant Jesus, the Messiah, is lifted up. And when they see this magnificent act of love on the cross, they will flock to him from the east and west and the north and south. This kingdom, of course, involves not just those who go to church, but everyone, all it says, because the church exists for others. It's not a club to meet our needs, but the church is there as a means to extend the kingdom of God into the world. And there's the story which you probably have heard about the lifeboat crew, who within a couple of generations it just becomes a museum and nobody goes out anymore to rescue. Sometimes church becomes a club very quickly where we just, we look at the boat and we look at the great rescues and we hear the stories, but nobody actually goes out into the water on a stormy day to rescue someone. Last week we were told to wake up by Paul in Romans, to put on the clothes that Jesus has given us to live and walk in the light. And this week Isaiah is saying, make a straight highway, make a straight way in the desert, make a highway for our God. When you build a straight road like the Romans, you fix a pole in the distance, maybe about a mile or half a mile, and then you get another Roman soldier and he then goes, and then you line the two up and you kind of go left and right or whatever, and depending on which way you're facing, and then when the two poles are lined up, then you put them down and then you build a straight road. In the English countryside though, particularly in Devon and Cornwall, we don't seem to go from A to B. We seem to go kind of like G.K. Chesterton, who's a Christian, who wrote a poem called The Rolling English Road, which starts with a cow or some livestock wandering through a forest or a wood, and then being chased by a dog and by another person, and then eventually that becomes a track, and then before you know it, that gets tarmacked one day for carts and horses, and that becomes the way from A to B. And instead of going 1 mile, it takes about 3 or 4 miles to get from A to B. Do we, as a church, is our church a highway to God for our community? Or is it a single track lane with grass in the middle, winding around through the woods and through the coppices with a few passing places? Do we make it accessible to those who have no experience of church, or do we put up barriers and hurdles and winding paths through forests that block the view to the kingdom of God with what we do and what we say? We were talking a bit earlier about one of the recommendations to understand the difficulties that people experience when they first come into church is to go and, if you've never done it, go and try and put a bed on a horse in a bedding shop and see how confusing and difficult that is. We honour the existing ways in which the saints worship, of course, we're committed to that, but we always look for ways for building a highway into the world so that people can find a way to God without any barriers getting in the way. Well, now I'd like us to consider tuning into our own identity or what we perceive church to be when it comes particularly to our weekly services. And I want us to ask the question, what radio station are we like? And there's a slide which should appear which has that on. You might have some printed copies of that, but if not, get a piece of blank paper, divide it into 4 and put Radio 1, Radio 2, Radio 3, Radio 4, and look at the different sections on the screen as they pop up. It's a light approach to how we might decide what kind of church style are we. And the intention here is not to stereotype or denigrate anyone's tradition, and you might find some crossover. Some of the different statements might be, in Radio 3 and Radio 4, and you might find that you've got a bit of both in your church. Hopefully, the general statements on this sheet will help you vocalise what you really are about. So look at the sheet and circle or write down on your blank piece of paper all the ones you know have happened in your church service in the last month. Don't include cluster-wide services. And then add up how many you've circled in each of the radio stations. And then we'll use that to have a discussion in a moment. So thank you. Well, hopefully you've done that exercise and had a little bit of fun. And now there's going to be, on the next slide, there's going to be 3 questions, and hopefully those will pop up. And I'd like you to break into groups if there's more than 4 of you, break into a couple of groups if there's, say, 7 or 8, and look at those 3 questions. Who do we exist for as church? What do our activities and our services say about this? And you might want to use the sheet that you've just filled in, or the exercise you've just done. And then what do we need to change to become the church that makes it easier to help someone with no church background to find Christ? So take about 5 minutes. Don't go off track. Some groups go off track here. Try to stay on task. Deal with the first question, second, third, and spend 5 minutes on each one. And then you can have a little bit of discussion afterwards with whoever's leading. Now I'd like us to think about tuning into our wider parish. We've thought a little about our own identity briefly as churches, because we could spend a lot more time on that, looking at what giftings we have, what strengths we have, what can we celebrate that's worked in the past, which can be a very useful exercise. But we also need to think about who are the people who make up the parish, the people who live around us outside our walls. And to do that, we need to cultivate listening skills, and that requires really listening and enter into meaningful dialogue with those within the parish who don't come to church. We need to go to them, not just people of our own demographic, and listen and discover what they really think. And that's something we've been encouraged to do with On the Way. And in fact, this is one of the exercises that's been the most difficult, in fact, to actually make contact with the missing generations and with those who don't come to church, has been negligible in terms of the 300 plus surveys that have been returned. And that's something we need to go back and address. And maybe it's a measure of how inward looking we are. Maybe it's not. but we need to have this meaningful dialogue with those in our community. But why do we need to observe their culture and their spirituality and how they spend their time and what they hold dear? Why would we do that? Well, the simple reason is, and it's biblical as well, is that God is at work in the world. As Rowan Williams, a former archbishop, said, mission is finding, and this is the mission of the church, is finding out what God is doing in the world and joining in. Pioneers call this hanging out. It's about listening, it's about watching, it's about being open to where the Spirit leads us. And as I said, it's biblical. We see Paul in Athens, go read the book of Acts, chapter 17. While he was waiting and to move on, he didn't really want to be there, he looked around at all the various gods of the Athenians. And then he sees this statue to an unknown god. And it says this, while Paul was waiting for them in Athens, he was greatly distressed. He was moved by the fact that they didn't know this God, and also by the idolatry there, to see that this city was full of idols. So he did something about it. He engaged with them. He reasoned, and the word there is dialogued, or dialogomai, in the synagogue with those Jews, both Jews and the God-fearing Greeks. And then, when they'd had enough of him, reasoning about what God had done in Jesus, he then went into the agora, the marketplace, day by day, with those who happened to be there. And a discussion follows, and then this group of philosophers called the Areopagus, they say, oh, we want to hear more. We love, they were like students, they just loved new and bright ideas. They didn't care what there was, as long as they were new and they'd not heard them, they wanted to know more. And so he gets invited, from doing all this hanging out and discussing with people, he gets invited to this meeting, and then he proclaims. He gets a mixed reaction as he does the Christian message. Some sneered, some rejected his challenge, but others, because he was prepared to take a risk, because he was prepared to put his neck on the line, wanted to know more, and they became Christians. So he's discovered that they're searching for the unknown, and he used that as a basis to talk about the God they didn't know, who wanted to know them. And he talks about how they can find him. He quotes their poetry, and he enters into this method of dialogue used by the Greek philosophers that he understood and was able to access. He visits the places where people are, the marketplace, not just say, come to church and hear about God. And then he hires a lecture hall, the lecture hall of Tyrannus, to reach the whole of Asia in 2 years. Before we can make a highway for others, a bridge between them and God, it means clearing some of the barriers that have got in the way, that stop them from finding him. And to do that, we have to find out where people are on their journey with seeking God, because God is at work. And if we don't hang out and engage and just stay as rabbit hole Christians, going from Christian meeting to meeting and service to service, we will not see what God is doing. And we will miss the opportunities, and we will miss the joy and the fun and the delight of seeing him at work in the lives of others. That's really the difficult part, though, isn't it? We've already begun to see the tensions in our churches, and it's okay to talk about those in the right way. The tension between what is and creating something new to reach those who aren't churched, so that we can make it clear for them. So let's lay some basic ground rules. And the first is this: we need to acknowledge that the church is itself a mixed economy. That there are those who want traditional worship, maybe more Radio 3, Radio 4, and there are those who want contemporary worship, Radio 1, and those who are Radio 2 used to be contemporary about 30, 40 years ago, but now they really listen to Radio 2 and they want, the best of Graham Kendrick, etc. So we need to acknowledge that and not be afraid, and hopefully that will help us to see, particularly if in our church there's a clear mix of two of those, that we have something going on that will create a tension. What we do will not please everyone, so let's affirm our differences, don't go to war over them, and recognise that people can find God in each of those different styles of worship. But the question is, if we are Radio 4 with a bit of Radio 3, and we like reading The Guardian or The Times or any other broadsheet of a similar nature, then our reading age is probably going to be 13 or 14. And our community's average reading age, the average reading age in the UK is 9. And to be able to read The Sun, it's 8. So if someone is coming to church and they don't read the broadsheets and they're more akin to reading the tabloids, they're going to have a problem. We were hearing about a certain vicar's son who used to play the trumpet in one of our churches, and he just couldn't understand the liturgy. It just didn't mean anything to him. The language of church was more Radio 4, and he needed it to be Radio 1 or Radio 2. We have a problem with our words and our vocabulary that they don't know. So being Radio 4 and Radio 3 in the context of worshipping with those people of like mind is fine. But if we want to reach our community and we discover that they are not from that background, there may be some who are, but if the majority of them have a far lower reading age, then we need to retune. So we have to explore, how do we retune what we do to reach the lost? Paul says, I become all things to all people. To the Jew I become a Jew, so that some might be saved. And a priest is not there to do it all for you, by the way. A priest, a minister, is there to enable all of those within the church to fulfill their priestly calling, because you are priests as well. I may be ordained into the Church of England as a priest, and may be paid for that, or not if I'm non-stipendiary, but you are a priest if you are a Christian. And we see the gifts, don't we? We see that in Ephesians, where the gifts are given to enable the church to do the work. So we have evangelists and apostles and preachers and teachers, and they're there to enable the church, the body, to do the work of mission. We exist as church for the lost souls. We're not clergy-centric. There's one of me, and there's probably a couple of hundred of you in the 5 churches. We exist for the lost souls of the parish, and I'm not here just to be a chaplain to the souls of all those who are already in church, and that's something I'm seeking to address. We search for those who are seeking God. We go looking to see what He's doing in the power of the Spirit. We go looking, as Jesus talks about, the worthy ones in Matthew 10 and verse 11. Whatever town or village you enter, He says to the disciples, search there for some worthy person and stay at their house until you leave. They're not worthy because they're perfect and they're holy, and they'll be kind of people who become nice, good, decent Christians. No, they're worthy because they receive the message and they're seeking, and God has already been at work in their lives. A few basic pointers to consider as we start that longer process of tuning into our communities is asking ourselves, is there something we need to lay down? Is there something we need to sacrifice that might be dear to us before we're ready to reach our community who are on a different wavelength? Do we need to give up some of our language that gets in the way? And in Romans 10, when it says, how can they hear unless someone goes to them and tells them? It talks about, blessed are the feet of those who bring good news. And the word here, akuo, means more than just hearing. Oh, they've heard the gospel. They came in one Sunday and they heard about Jesus, and, it's tough. No, to hear in Greek means to understand, to comprehend. So if you want to start the discourse, the dialogue with those who are outside the church, you could say, do you think church is relevant? And what should the church be doing to make it more relevant today? You could be asking those questions. You could even ask a very straightforward question that we've been thinking about with On the Way. What could we do to support you more? And that's something to take on board yourself in talking to your family or your friends or those people you bump into in the shops or the pubs or whatever. But I'd like us now to read the two passages that are going to be popping up. The first is Isaiah 11, 1-10, and you might want to get a Bible so that you can have this in front of you as well, in your groups, to read Isaiah 11, 1-10, and then read Isaiah 40, verses 3-5. And then there have been a couple of questions that will pop up after you've read those passages, which will probably be on the screen as well, so you can pause and read them together. And then after you've done that, put the two questions up. What needs to be laid low or levelled for us, particularly as we think about Advent, so that we can effectively be the Christians and the church here today in our communities? And then secondly, how do we prepare as a Christian and as a church for the kingdom to break into our communities? So spend a good 5-10 minutes reading through that, considering those questions, have a little bit of discussion, and then maybe spend another 5 or 10 minutes praying for your local community, praying that God would guide you and that he would show you where you need to go to talk to people and to listen. Well, hopefully that was a rewarding time, and hopefully you've saturated all that you've been thinking about in prayer. God's brought something into your mind, into your heart, a concern, and he's starting to shape you and to get you ready for being that person that forms those links with the world around, for taking the good news of being salt and light into your community. But now I'd like us to close with the on the way prayer. I'm just going to put the on the way prayer on. It's just going to stay on for a few minutes. So if you'd all like to say that together, if someone will lead, and you can say that together, because I've realised that there are actually two, like the Lord's Prayer, there are two variations. There's a modern one and a not so modern one, and I've been showing the older one and saying the newer one. So I'm hoping that the one on the screen will be the one that you see, that you know well, and pray that together, and then have a really good evening, and we'll see you back next week. Thank you.